You spent years carrying weight that no one even noticed you were holding. It didn't start with some big moment or dramatic shift. It began quietly through favors you said yes to even when your chest felt tight, through late-night calls where you hid your exhaustion, through moments where someone else's crisis felt more urgent than your own pain. You didn't choose to be the fixer. The role just settled on your shoulders, and you let it stay there because saying no felt wrong, almost cruel. You became the person people depended on before they even tried to depend on themselves. Whenever their world cracked, you rushed in like it was your responsibility to repair what life had broken in them. You always found the right words. You always rearranged your schedule. You always pushed aside your own feelings because someone else's needs sounded louder than the quiet ache in your chest. Some nights, you sat in a dim kitchen with your elbows on the table and your phone glowing, your face a pale blue. Another crisis, another emotional emergency, another situation you didn't create but somehow became responsible for. And even if your hands were shaking from exhaustion, you still typed out comforting messages. You still stayed on the call longer than necessary. You still absorbed their fear, their confusion, their anger, until the emotional noise in your mind drowned out your own thoughts. The strange thing was, nobody ever asked if you were okay. They assumed you were fine because you were functioning, because you didn't complain, because you always showed up. You were the dependable one, the strong one, the one with answers and calm logic and endless emotional bandwidth. They didn't see how heavy your heart felt after every conversation. They didn't see how you sat on the edge of your bed afterward, staring at the wall, wondering why helping others felt like losing small parts of yourself. You wore your self-neglect like it was a badge of honor. You convinced yourself that being tired meant you were doing something good, that being drained meant you were valuable, that sacrificing your peace proved you were a loyal person. But inside, something in you kept shrinking. You were teaching everyone that your energy was free, your time wasn't personal, and your emotions didn't matter, and they believed it. You could be having a difficult day, trying to keep yourself together, and still if someone else needed you, you pushed your own pain aside like it was inconvenient. It didn't even occur to you to set limits. You didn't allow yourself to disconnect. You didn't give yourself permission to rest. Your mind was constantly scanning the people around you, anticipating their needs, adjusting your behavior, preparing to catch them if they fell. And every time you felt guilty for wanting to step back, guilty for not replying fast enough, guilty for needing silence, guilty for feeling overwhelmed, guilty for being human, this guilt wrapped around your decisions so tightly that even small acts of self-care felt like rebellion. You were scared of disappointing people, scared of letting them down, scared that if you failed to fix something, they would see you differently, less useful, less important, less worth keeping. Somewhere along the way, you confused being needed with being loved. You kept giving because you were afraid that if you stopped, the people who leaned on you would walk away. You carried the weight of their world because it felt safer than carrying the weight of your own fears. It was easier to solve someone else's mess than to face your own loneliness. Easier to distract yourself with responsibility than to admit you wanted support too. But slowly, the cost began showing. You caught yourself zoning out mid-conversation, your mind too tired to engage. You felt resentment bubbling under your kindness, a feeling you hated because it didn't match your image of yourself. You started waking up already exhausted, even on days when nothing was wrong. You felt disconnected from your own needs, almost numb to what you truly wanted. There were moments when you stared at yourself in the mirror and barely recognized the person looking back. Not because you looked different, but because you felt hollow, spread thin across too many expectations. And then came the moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, where you finally saw what you had been avoiding. Maybe it happened while you sat alone in your car with your forehead resting on the steering wheel. Maybe it happened when someone asked for something so simple, and you felt your body silently scream, "I can't." Maybe it happened when you canceled a plan because you just couldn't make yourself move. In that moment, you knew you were drowning, Not in water, but in guilt. Every time you tried to save someone, a piece of you sank deeper. You kept giving breath to people who weren't even trying to swim. And even though no one handed you their pain intentionally, you kept collecting it until it felt like an identity. But this realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. You don't have to keep carrying everything. You don't have to fix situations you didn't break. You don't have to apologize for wanting peace. You don't have to be the emergency exit for everyone around you. You are allowed to step away without guilt. You are allowed to protect your energy. You are allowed to choose a life where your needs matter too. The world won't collapse because you set a boundary. Someone else's emotions are not your homework. Their healing is not your job. Their stability is not your responsibility. You are not the solution to everyone's story. For the first time, you are learning that your life doesn't need to orbit around other people's struggles. You can sit with your own feelings without rushing to silence them with someone else's problems. You can rest without feeling like you owe the world an explanation. You can allow yourself to be human, not a fixer, not a savior, not a constant support system, just you. This is the beginning of taking your life back. The moment you finally understand, you were never meant to drown so others could breathe. There comes a point where the weight you carry stops feeling heavy because it has been on your shoulders for so long that it becomes familiar. You didn't notice when it started, when other people's problems began stacking inside you one by one, but you definitely noticed the moment you realized you had no space left for yourself. You had become the silent container for emotions that weren't yours, worries you didn't create, and responsibilities you never asked for. For a long time, you didn't even question it. You were the one people came to when they felt lost, when they needed comfort, when their world was falling apart. You listened, you soothed, you helped them connect dots in their life that they never bothered to untangle on their own. And while their shoulders relaxed after talking to you, yours tightened a little more each time. It was subtle the way your energy drained without anyone noticing. Burnout didn't hit you like a crash. It crept in on quiet afternoons, on days when you found yourself staring into space, unsure why your body felt heavier than usual. You were functioning but not living. You were present but not connected to yourself. Somewhere along the way, emotional exhaustion became your normal. People thanked you for being there. They said they didn't know what they'd do without you. They praised your patience, your kindness, your ability to understand things before they even explained them. But praise doesn't refill an empty heart. Gratitude doesn't heal the exhaustion in your bones. Their relief came at a price you kept paying without complaining, because a part of you believed this was your role, maybe even your obligation. But the truth no one sees is that being the fixer means you never get to fall apart in front of anyone. You never get to break. You never get to say, I can't do this. Because people expect you to always know what to do, even when you're silently collapsing inside yourself. You've carried so much that sometimes you can't tell where their pain ends and yours begins. There were evenings when you sat in your room, staring at your phone, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and exhaustion. You didn't want to answer another message. You didn't want to give another pep talk. You didn't want to solve another emotional puzzle. But you did it anyway, because the thought of disappointing someone felt worse than the fatigue settling like dust inside your mind. Giving became your default setting. It didn't matter if you were exhausted, busy, or hurting if someone needed you. You bent yourself until you fit their needs. You adjusted your schedule, your mood, your energy. You pushed yourself beyond your limits because somewhere deep down you believed that caring meant overextending. But what about you? When did you last check on yourself with the same tenderness you gave everyone else? When did you last sit down and ask, what do I need right now? When did you last hold space for your own emotions without pushing them aside? The truth is, you lost sight of your own needs because you were too busy managing everyone else's crises. You forgot what it felt like to choose something purely because it mattered to you. You forgot what it felt like to rest without feeling guilty. You forgot how to be present in your own life because you were constantly stepping into everyone else's story. Your identity got tangled in the role people assigned to you. You became the problem solver, the emotional caretaker, the one who always has it together. And the more you lived inside that identity, the more your own wounds slipped out of sight. The fixer role became a mask, one you wore so often that you started believing it was your true face. It hid the parts of you that were hurting. It gave you something to focus on so you didn't have to confront your own fears or disappointments. Fixing became a distraction from the places inside you that needed healing. You helped others process breakups, but didn't face your own heartbreak. You comforted friends in their loneliness, but ignored the hollow ache sitting quietly inside your chest. You guided people through their confusion, but never admitted how lost you often felt. You supported dreams that weren't yours because it felt safer than exploring your own. Every time someone leaned on you, a part of you whispered, "At least I'm useful." But usefulness is not love, and giving endlessly is not the same as being valued. You deserved someone who looked at you and saw how much you were carrying. You deserved someone who asked, "How are you, really?" You deserved someone who didn't only show up when they needed something, but instead, you spent so long pouring into others that you forgot what it felt like to be filled. And here's what hurts the most. People rarely notice the emotional load you carry because you make it look easy. They assume you're strong because you've always been strong. They assume you're okay because you've survived every breakdown silently. They assume you don't need help because you never ask for it. But strength that never rests eventually breaks. This is where you finally start seeing the truth. You were carrying everyone, but no one was carrying you. You were giving without receiving, listening without being heard, supporting without being supported. And the fixer role, the role that made you feel valuable, was the very thing hiding the fact that you were hurting. You're not weak for feeling drained. You're not selfish for wanting space. You're not wrong for needing support, too. You're human. You deserve a life where your needs matter. You deserve relationships where your heart is held with the same gentleness you offer others. You deserve to be seen, not just depended on. This section is your awakening the moment you finally acknowledge that the person who needs your care the most right now is you. There's a quiet moment in your life. You don't talk about the moment you first realized being useful made people treat you differently. It didn't happen with some grand emotional scene. It happened through small reactions, small shifts, the way people smiled wider when you helped them, how they talked to you more on days they needed something. You learned early that being helpful made you wanted. Being needed made you important. So you built your identity around usefulness without even knowing you were doing it. And slowly, your worth got tied to how much you could give, how much you could fix, how quickly you could step in. It became instinct, the way you jumped up when someone hinted at discomfort, the way you rearranged your day to ease someone else's stress, the way you solved problems that weren't even yours to solve. You weren't just being kind, you were trying to feel like you mattered. But there's a painful truth hidden inside that mindset. When your worth depends on what you can do for others, you start disappearing behind their needs. You became the background character in your own story. The one who listens, not the one who speaks. The one who comforts, not the one who's comforted. The one who stays steady, even when your own world is shaking. People came to you with their mess, their worries, their emotional storms, and you stepped aside as if your own space didn't exist. Their problems filled your days. Their needs shaped your schedule. Their moods decided the tone of your interactions. You were present in their lives, but almost absent in your own. And the saddest part, most of them didn't even notice. They didn't see the way your energy dimmed. They didn't see how you held your breath before offering help, hoping someone would say, "It's okay, you don't have to." They didn't see how tired your eyes looked when the conversation ended. They only saw the version of you that made their life easier. Your invisibility wasn't loud, it was silent, polite, and painfully subtle. You didn't speak up when you were overwhelmed because you didn't want to seem difficult. You didn't set boundaries because you didn't want to hurt anyone. You didn't say, "I need space," because you didn't want to be misunderstood. Boundaries felt dangerous to you not because you lacked strength, but because you were terrified of rejection. Every time you thought about creating distance, a whisper inside you said, "If you pull back, they'll leave." Every time you tried to say no, guilt curled around your words and swallowed them. Every time you considered prioritizing yourself, fear told you that you were being selfish. You weren't just learning to help, you were learning to earn connection through service. So you let people take and take and take, not because they were bad people, but because you never stopped them. You kept showing up with open hands even when your palms were empty. You stretched yourself thin, trying to be the reliable one, the calm one, the one who could handle everything without breaking. But inside, you were breaking, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the kind of breaking that looks like silence, numbness, emotional fatigue. There were days when you felt like you were standing behind a glass wall, watching your own life happen without you. You could hear the noise, see the movement, feel the pressure, but none of it felt connected to who you truly were. You were playing a role, and the role was swallowing you whole. And it wasn't just boundaries you feared losing love. You believed that if you stopped fixing things, people would stop coming to you. If you stopped helping, you'd stop being needed. If you stopped being needed, you'd stop being loved. You confused dependency with affection, attention with care, obligation with closeness. So you stayed available even when it hurt. You stayed useful even when it drained you. You stayed present even when you felt invisible. But a moment came, maybe soft, maybe sharp, when you finally saw what was happening. Maybe someone asked for a favor that pushed you to your limit, and instead of feeling helpful, you felt resentment rise like a warning. Maybe you tried to express your own pain and realized the people around you didn't know how to hold space for you because they'd never had to. Maybe you caught yourself pretending to be okay when you weren't, and the pretending felt suffocating. Whatever triggered it, the realization hit deeply. You were disappearing inside everyone else's chaos. You were abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable. You were shrinking your needs to keep relationships intact. You were burying your emotions under their expectations. You were losing your voice in the noise of everyone else's problems. And suddenly, you saw it clearly, the version of you that always said yes, the version that never rested, the version that only felt worthy when you were being useful, was not the real you. It was the version you created to survive, to be accepted, to feel valued, to avoid being alone. But the real you, the version buried under all that responsibility, was tired of disappearing. You wanted connection, not transaction. You wanted love that wasn't conditional on service. You wanted presence without performance. You wanted space to breathe without feeling guilty. You wanted to exist in your relationships, not just support them. This realization is painful, yes. It asks you to confront the truth that your patterns weren't acts of love, they were acts of fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of being seen as too much, fear of being seen as someone who needs help too. But this realization is also powerful, because the moment you see how you disappeared, you can begin to return to yourself. You can learn that boundaries aren't rejection, they're protection. You can learn that you don't have to sacrifice yourself to be loved. You can learn that your value isn't measured by what you provide. You can learn that you deserve relationships where you can breathe. This is the part of your journey where you step out from behind everyone else's shadows and finally say, I matter too. You are not here to vanish inside someone else's chaos. You are here to live your life fully, visibly, honestly, and without apology. There comes a moment when the noise around you grows so loud that silence becomes the only place you can hear your own thoughts. You didn't used to believe you deserved silence. You didn't used to believe you had the right to step back. For so long, every pause felt like guilt. Every moment of quiet felt like failure. Your mind was trained to think that if you weren't responding, if you weren't available, if you weren't participating in other people's emotional rhythms, something was wrong with you. But now, slowly, you're learning that silence is not a confession. It's not betrayal. It's not a sign that you love people any less. It's simply a moment where you let yourself exist without pressure. You don't owe anyone an explanation for needing space. You don't have to justify your absence, your slow replies, your desire for a day without noise. People who care about you don't require constant proof of your loyalty. They don't measure your affection by how quickly you respond or how often you say yes. You've spent too long treating your time like something that belongs to everyone but you, giving it away because you were afraid of disappointing people. But here's what you're finally beginning to understand. Saying no is not cruelty. It's not rejection. It's not you pushing people away. It's you choosing balance. It's you choosing a life where your emotions matter too. The word no used to get stuck in your throat. You rehearsed it in your mind, softened it, wrapped it in apologies, twisted it into something polite enough that it wouldn't hurt anyone. Even then, you barely said it out loud. You were afraid people would misinterpret your boundaries as anger. You were afraid they'd call you distant, cold, ungrateful. You were afraid they'd pull back and never return. But the truth is, the people who get angry when you say no were never looking for you. They were looking for your compliance. You are not responsible for protecting someone from their own disappointment. You are not responsible for cushioning their reactions. You are not responsible for bending until you break just to keep the peace. Space isn't distance, it's healing. It's the moment where you reconnect with your own voice after losing it in the noise of everyone else's expectations. You've been conditioned to believe that constant availability is a sign of loyalty, that being reachable at every moment proves you care, that saying yes, no matter how exhausted you are, means you're a good friend, a good partner, a good person. But love isn't measured in proximity. Care isn't measured by how much you sacrifice. Healthy relationships don't demand your emotional exhaustion. When you always show up instantly, when you never pause, when you never say, I need a moment, you create a version of yourself that looks unbreakable. But you're not unbreakable, you've just been hiding your limits. And hiding your limits doesn't make you strong, it makes you invisible to yourself. There were days when you wished you could disappear for a while. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to breathe without feeling watched, enough to think without being interrupted, enough to rest without feeling guilty. You stayed online, you kept answering messages, you kept showing up because you didn't want anyone to say you'd changed. But you are changing, and that's a good thing. You're outgrowing the version of yourself that was always available. You're letting go of the belief that silence requires explanation. You're trusting that the people meant for you will understand your pauses. You're realizing that your time is something precious, not something to be given away freely to anyone who asks. There's a type of peace that only comes when you step away from the noise long enough to hear yourself again. In that quiet space, you can finally feel your own emotions without being tangled in someone else's. In that stillness, you notice how tired you've been, how much you've ignored, how long you've been surviving instead of living. This space becomes a mirror, one that reflects the parts of you that have been neglected. You start seeing your own needs more clearly. You begin to recognize when you're overwhelmed. You start noticing what drains you and what nourishes you. You begin to remember that your life belongs to you, not to the constant demands of others. And little by little, you start reclaiming pieces of yourself. You put your phone down without guilt. You take a walk alone without apologizing. You choose rest without explaining. You allow yourself to leave conversations you don't have the energy for. You give yourself the grace to simply exist without performing. It feels unfamiliar at first, like wearing a new skin. But slowly, your body starts relaxing into the freedom. You realize you don't need to defend your silence. Silence is your right. Silence is a boundary without words. Silence is the moment where you gather yourself before returning to the world. As you protect your space, you also begin to see the truth about your relationships. The ones who value you won't panic when you pause. They won't guilt trip you for needing time. They won't assume the worst when you step back. They will give you room to breathe because they understand that love grows in freedom, not pressure. And the ones who can't handle your boundaries, they were only attached to the version of you that existed for their convenience. This realization hurts, but it also liberates you. You're no longer bending into shapes that betray your well-being. You're no longer offering emotional support that empties you. You're no longer confusing availability with love. You're no longer afraid to be absent when you need to reconnect with yourself. You deserve moments that belong only to you. You deserve space that isn't interrupted. You deserve rest that doesn't come with guilt. You deserve relationships that don't punish you for protecting your peace. This section of your life is where you learn the quiet power of pulling back, not because you're cold, not because you're distant, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally realized your heart needs room to breathe too. Guilt clung to you like an old ringtone, still ringing long after the moment had passed. Guilt didn't begin as your instinct. It was taught to you quietly, slowly, through reactions, expectations, and the unspoken rules that shape the way you move through life. It wasn't forced onto you violently. It slipped in like background noise. Every time you hesitated to help, every time you paused to think of yourself, every time you wanted something for your own well-being, you felt that familiar tug in your chest. A whisper that said, "You should be doing more." It wasn't your voice. It was a leftover echo from the way you were raised, the environment you lived in, the relationships that rewarded you for overextending and questioned you when you didn't. Somewhere in your history, you learned that caring for yourself came second. You learned that being considerate meant being available. You learned that love came with responsibility, not balance. You learned that saying yes kept the peace, while saying no invited conflict. And because you wanted harmony, because you wanted to be good, supportive, reliable, you kept choosing others over yourself until that choice became automatic. That's how guilt got wired into you. When you finally tried to choose yourself, even in small ways, the discomfort felt overwhelming. Something as simple as taking a day off, stepping away from a draining conversation, or telling someone you needed time made your stomach twist. You weren't doing anything wrong, but your mind was reacting like you were breaking some invisible rule. Choosing yourself triggered shame, because somewhere deep inside, you had been taught that your needs were inconvenient. You internalized the idea that the only acceptable form of kindness was self-sacrifice. You mistook burnout for compassion. You mistook exhaustion for dedication. You mistook silence for loyalty. You mistook rest for selfishness. You told yourself that if you weren't constantly doing something for someone, you weren't being a good person. The world had conditioned you to think your value came from effort, from giving, from being the one who always said, "I'll handle it." But resting is not selfish. It's necessary. It's human. Your body knew it long before your mind accepted it. That's why you felt that bone-deep tiredness, that heaviness behind your eyes, that mental fog that made even basic decisions harder. That's why sometimes you sat on your bed, not sad, not angry, just empty. That emptiness wasn't failure, it was your system telling you that you'd been running on low for too long. But guilt distorted everything. It made you feel like stopping was quitting. It made you feel like letting go was abandoning. It made you feel like prioritizing yourself was a betrayal. The truth is, the guilt wasn't protecting you, it was controlling you. A leftover piece of programming designed for a version of you that lived in survival, not growth. Letting go felt wrong because guilt had been your compass for so long. It guided your choices. It guided your relationships. It guided your identity. Without it, you felt untethered, unsure of who you were supposed to be. It's strange how something harmful can feel familiar enough to seem safe, but familiarity isn't safety. And guilt isn't guidance, it's residue. As you began to question the narratives you grew up with, things started to shift. You realized that the guilt wasn't coming from your present self. It was coming from an old script written by people who needed you to be compliant, available, selfless, small. They benefited from your guilt because your guilt made you easier to influence. You never considered how much you lost by carrying it. Think about the moments you wanted to decline an invitation because you were mentally drained but said yes anyway. Think about the nights you couldn't sleep because you worried someone would misinterpret your silence. Think about how many times you said, "I'm fine," when you weren't, because your discomfort felt like an inconvenience. Think about how many dreams you postponed because other people's needs felt more urgent. Think about how often you let people stay in your life simply because you were guilty of letting them go. You shaped your entire life around avoiding guilt, not around seeking peace. But now something inside you is waking up. A part of you is beginning to understand that guilt doesn't have authority over you. It doesn't know the future. It doesn't know your heart. It doesn't know the cost of carrying everyone else's life on your back. You are starting to see guilt for what it truly is, a signal of old conditioning, not a sign that you're doing something wrong. Every time you choose yourself, every time you rest, every time you step away from chaos, guilt shows up, but that doesn't mean you should turn back. It means you're entering new territory. Territory your mind hasn't learned to feel safe in yet. Releasing guilt is not a single moment. It's a slow, steady unlearning. It's catching yourself apologizing for things that don't need apologies. It's reminding yourself you're allowed to pause before responding. It's validating your own exhaustion without asking for permission. It's understanding that your needs are not obligations, they are rights. As you release guilt, something beautiful begins to happen. You start feeling lighter, not in big dramatic ways, but in small ways that accumulate quietly. Your breathing softens. Your mind becomes clearer, your decisions feel more aligned, your emotions become easier to understand, your relationships grow healthier and more honest, and most importantly, you begin to feel free, truly free, for the first time in a long time. Freedom doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives as a long exhale. Sometimes it arrives as a moment of peace in a room where you used to feel pressured. Sometimes it arrives as the courage to say, "I can't do this right now." Sometimes it arrives as the quiet realization that you no longer feel responsible for managing everyone else's emotions. This is what reclaiming your freedom looks like. Not running away from people, but returning to yourself. Not abandoning love, but choosing love that doesn't come with chains. Not becoming selfish, but learning that self-respect is a form of truth. The guilt that once ruled you is losing its power. The programming that taught you to shrink is fading. Your self-worth is rising from beneath the rubble of old expectations. You are becoming someone who chooses peace without apology, someone who rests without guilt, someone who lets go without fear, someone who understands that freedom isn't granted, it's reclaimed, and you're reclaiming it now. Silence didn't just visit you, it sat beside you like an old friend you finally recognized. Healing didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement. It didn't spill into your life with fireworks or loud affirmations. It came quietly, in moments that looked ordinary from the outside, the soft hum of a fan, the stillness of early mornings, the way your breath settled deeper than before. You weren't chasing noise anymore. You weren't scrambling to keep up with the weight of other lives. For the first time in a long time, you let the quiet surround you without rushing to fill it. At first, the quiet felt strange. You weren't used to this kind of space. Your mind had always been crowded thoughts, layered over worries, layered over expectations. Now there was room. Room to sit with yourself. Room to feel things you used to bury. Room to breathe without guilt. And in that quiet, something began to shift. Healing always starts in stillness, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is finally being felt. You didn't realize how much grief you were carrying until the noise faded. There were relationships you had poured yourself into that left you drained. There were roles you played for so long that letting them go felt like losing a part of yourself. There were patterns that once felt like survival but had turned into cages you kept unlocking with trembling hands. Letting go wasn't easy. It never is. You grieved the versions of people you wished they were. You grieved the version of yourself who kept trying. You grieved the comfort of old habits, even the toxic ones, because they were familiar. You grieved the years you spent ignoring your own needs. You grieved the identity built around being the one who held everything together. Grief didn't mean you made the wrong decision. It meant you were finally honest about what it cost you. And in that grief, a quiet question rose inside you. If I am no longer everything for everyone, then who am I for myself? This question wasn't frightening anymore. It was liberating. For years, who you were depended on what you offered others. Your identity lived in conversations where you comforted, fixed, repaired, soothed. Your worth was tied to usefulness. Your time was shaped by demands. Your emotional landscape was shaped by other people's storms. But now, in this calm, you were meeting the version of you that had been waiting behind all that noise. The version that didn't exist to solve. The version that didn't exist to prove. The version that didn't exist to carry. The version that existed simply to be. Stillness has a way of clearing the fog you didn't know you were walking through. You began seeing yourself more clearly. Your emotions didn't feel foreign anymore. Your desires didn't feel unreasonable. Your boundaries didn't feel like warnings, they felt like definitions. You started noticing small things, the way your chest loosened when you weren't rushing to respond, the way your mind softened when you allowed yourself to rest, the way your spirit felt lighter when you weren't overthinking how you were perceived. This clarity wasn't loud, it was steady. It whispered instead of shouting. It showed you what mattered. It showed you what drained you. It showed you who supported your growth and who only supported your struggle. It showed you who you were becoming, someone rooted, someone aware, someone whole. You didn't need to be busy to feel valuable anymore. You didn't need to be overwhelmed to feel needed. You didn't need to be exhausted to feel worthy. This stillness became a mirror, one that didn't distort your reflection. For the first time, you saw yourself without the weight of roles you outgrew. You saw the softness, the resilience, the exhaustion, the hope. You saw the parts of you that needed care and the parts that were ready to rise. This space wasn't empty, it was sacred. You began asking yourself the questions you never had time to ask. What makes me feel alive? What drains the color from my day? Who do I become when no one needs anything from me? What kind of life feels like mine, truly mine? These questions didn't pressure you, they guided you. They helped you separate your identity from your obligations. They helped you recognize the difference between love and responsibility, between obligation and connection, between habit and desire. More importantly, they helped you understand yourself without guilt. You started noticing where peace felt natural. You started recognizing the texture of genuine joy, the kind that wasn't tied to someone else's approval. You started building rituals not for productivity, but for presence. You started choosing people who honored your boundaries, not those who tested them. You started letting your inner voice matter more than external expectations. Piece by piece, you began rebuilding a life that wasn't built on exhaustion, a life where rest wasn't earned, it was allowed, a life where silence wasn't avoidance, it was clarity, a life where distance wasn't rejection, it was self-respect, a life where choosing yourself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. You learned that healing doesn't ask you to become a different person. It asks you to return to the person you were before the world taught you to shrink. In this quiet, you became aware of your patterns. You noticed your triggers. You understood your needs. You valued your own emotional bandwidth. You saw your history without letting it dictate your future. This is self-awareness, not a buzzword, but a homecoming. It's recognizing yourself again after years of being buried beneath responsibility. It's realizing your worth is inherent, not earned. It's understanding that healing isn't the absence of pain, it's the presence of truth. You are building a life that finally fits who you are becoming, a life shaped by intention, not obligation, a life guided by clarity, not guilt, a life rooted in self-awareness, not self-erasure. You're learning to honor your inner world the same way you once honored everyone else's. You're learning to stay present long enough to hear what your heart has been whispering for years. You're learning that peace isn't something you chase, it's something you allow. And in this stillness, something powerful is happening. You're no longer just healing, you're transforming. You stepped out of everyone's expectations, like walking out of a burning room. You didn't realize you were trapped inside. You're not the same person you were when this journey began. You can feel it in the way your body moves through the day, in the way your mind no longer tightens at the thought of disappointing someone, in the way your heart holds itself with more steadiness than fear. You've become someone who no longer bends their entire world around keeping others comfortable. You've become someone who recognizes that your life is not a repair shop and you are not a tool for anyone's convenience. For the first time in a long time, you're breathing like the air belongs to you. You don't exist to fix people anymore. Not because you've stopped caring, but because you've stopped abandoning yourself. You've stopped rushing into emotional fires that were never yours to put out. You've stopped answering every call for help as if you were the last lifeline they had. You've stopped treating other people's instability like a responsibility carved into your skin. You finally understand something that took years to learn. Your empathy is a gift, not a leash. Your energy no longer spills into places that drain you. Your attention no longer gets swallowed by people who only show up in crisis. Your time no longer disappears into conversations that leave you feeling smaller than before. Now, your energy belongs to your purpose, not to the endless needs of people who never pause to ask how carrying them made you feel. You've redirected your strength into your own growth, your own dreams, your own inner world. It's not selfishness, it's reclamation. You're choosing the life you want to build instead of the chaos you used to manage. You're learning what it means to wake up without guilt tugging at your thoughts. You're learning what it means to exist without the pressure to monitor everyone else's emotional temperature. You're learning that peace isn't the absence of sound, it's the absence of obligation masquerading as love. Your peace is no longer negotiable. Your boundaries are no longer loose threads for people to pull. Your worth is no longer tied to the problems you can solve. And with guilt no longer dictating your choices, love begins to change. Love becomes softer, love becomes slower, love becomes something that doesn't demand your silence. Love becomes something that doesn't punish your honesty. Love becomes something that expands with you, not at the expense of you. You love without losing yourself now. You don't disappear just to make someone else more comfortable. You don't silence your needs just to keep the peace. You don't shrink your opinions, your desires, your presence. You don't blend into someone else's narrative. You don't switch yourself off to avoid conflict. You stay whole even when you care deeply. You stay present without sacrificing your inner stability. You stay honest even when honesty risks changing relationships. You stay authentic even when someone wants you to play your old role. Your connections now grow from mutual effort, mutual understanding, mutual respect, not from one-sided emotional labor. You've outgrown situations where you were loved only for what you could provide. You're stepping into relationships where you're loved for who you are. This is your return, not the return to your old self. That person was shaped by survival. This is a return to the self you've never had, the space to fully become. You are returning unburdened, not weightless, but aware of which weights were never yours. You are returning real, not perfect, but grounded in truth instead of guilt. You are returning whole, not because everything is fixed, but because you stopped trying to fix everyone else. This version of you is powerful in ways you never imagined. You speak more clearly now because you aren't afraid of being misunderstood. You rest without apology because you understand your worth isn't measured in exhaustion. You choose solitude without reading it as loneliness. You allow yourself joy without waiting for permission. You walk away from chaos without trying to make it comfortable first. You let people be responsible for their own healing without feeling like you've done something wrong. And perhaps the most beautiful part, you finally made room for yourself. Room to feel, room to think, room to grow, room to rebuild, room to dream beyond the limits guilt once kept you inside. You've reached a place where your past self wouldn't recognize you in the best possible way. You're no longer guided by fear of rejection or the pressure to earn your worth. You're guided by clarity, by self-respect, by the understanding that your life is allowed to be gentle, balanced, and deeply yours. You've become someone who chooses love, not obligation. Someone who chooses peace, not performance. Someone who chooses growth, not guilt. Someone who chooses authenticity, not emotional survival. This final chapter of your journey isn't about becoming new. It's about finally being yourself without carrying the world on your back. You've walked through exhaustion. You've walked through guilt. You've walked through self-neglect. You've walked through silence. You've walked through grief. And now you're walking into freedom with steady steps. You're not fixing others. You're building yourself. And somewhere inside you, a quiet voice is saying something you haven't heard in years. I'm finally home.